how to smash any visual arts questions. The visual arts exam is made up of two sections. Firstly, section 1, which is unseen images, and then section 2, which is an extended response question. But you will not be able to answer any of it without knowing the key content areas of visual arts. Content areas. What? In visual arts, there are three main areas of content. Firstly, there is practice. Now, practice is broken up into two components. Firstly, we have art making. Right now, essentially art making is the making of artworks. So an artist's practice is intentions plus choices plus actions. Okay, and this can refer to the art making practice of artists that you have studied or your own art making practice as an artist. Now, practice can also refer to critical and historical studies. Now, there is a key difference between these two forms of studies. Firstly, critical or art criticism is looking at interpreting the visual arts by investigating or writing about artists, their artwork, styles, and audience responses. Now, the key element to critical studies is that there is a judgment being made. For example, the judgment on the value of particular artworks created by artists. Whereas historical studies or art history is looking more at learning about artworks and the significant ideas in visual arts over time. That includes how they have been interpreted at certain times and over time. Alright, now the second key area of content refers to the conceptual framework. And the conceptual framework is concerned with the relationships between the four agencies. The four agencies are called world, artwork, audience, and artist. Now, if we break these up quickly, we can acknowledge that the world is looking at the regional, national, global events that were occurring in the world at the time. Now, this may refer to social status, ideologies, or simply events such as world wars, economic crisis, etc. Now, the artwork is a physical representation of ideas. So, the way ideas are actually being presented to the audience through a visual manner. All right, now the artist, the most obvious one, is the person who actually creates the artwork. So, you're looking at the who, the what, the how, and the why. Okay, the why, of course, being the intentions behind the work. Now, the audience is the viewer. Okay, so those people who view the artworks. Now, these people can include, of course, art historians or art critics, as represented through our study of practice, or even the media, other artists, or the general public. All right, now, what is important about the conceptual framework is that you understand the relationship between these four agencies and that they are connected and impact upon one another. And you will often, with a conceptual framework question, be required to identify this relationship and write how they impact upon one another. Now, the frames is a final area of content, and there are four of them. Firstly, there's the postmodern frame, then the subjective frame, cultural frame, and the structural frame. Now, just quickly, the postmodern frame is looking at how the ideas or artworks that are being created are challenging the mainstream. Okay, so challenging traditional conventions, ways of creating art, or the ideas that have been used to be explored in order to create art. Okay, so it's all about the challenge. So artists such as Marcel Duchamp would be an example of a postmodern artist. Now, subjective frame refers more so to the personal. Okay, it's a subjective response. Artists are using deeply felt experiences or feelings, memories in order to generate their artworks. And artists from the German Expressionist period are artists who work predominantly from the subjective framework. Now, as an artist, if you're working using the subjective frame, then you're exploring your own personal experiences as a source of information or a source of guidance. Now, if we look at the cultural frame, then that is looking obviously at culture. So we're looking at cultural and social ideologies that are happening in the world at the time, your world or the artist's world, depending on your perspective. Now, the structural frame, the fourth frame, is looking more at the way signs and symbols have been used to create meaning. So we're looking at the compositional elements of the work. So if you're breaking down an artwork from the structural perspective, you are looking at the elements and principles of design. So the use of color, line, texture, any recognizable symbols, and how it contributes to meaning. All right, so that's just a basic overview of the key content areas. And if you think about it, you have been utilizing all three of these both as an artist as well as in your exploration of different artists, whether you know that or not. The key is, though, is that you start to become a little bit more aware, a little bit more conscious of the fact that you are using these different content areas. And over the next couple of months, really try to pinpoint when you're using these different areas of content. This will make it a lot easier for you to answer questions on these particular content areas if you're used to sort of reflecting on them, even if only for your own art making practice. So how do you know what content area is being addressed? Well, you need to look for the key words that are presented within the question, because these give you clues to what content area you're focusing on. So, for example, if you are given words such as practice in a question, you know that you'll be dealing with practice. If you're given the word relationships, it's most likely that you are going to deal with the conceptual framework, because it's concerned with the relationship between the four agencies. If you're given words such as gender, identity, values and beliefs, then you'll be looking at the cultural frame. Whereas if you're looking at signs and symbols, you'll be looking at the structural frame. Imagination, looking at the subjective frame. Appropriation or challenged is looking at the postmodern frame. If you're given terms like judgment, you're looking at art criticism. Okay, so they're just a couple of examples of keywords that you may come across. In order to improve your ability to identify keywords, start creating a word bank in your visual arts diary where you start to associate different terms and they're linked to these different content areas. Having the ability to identify the different content areas that are being addressed will be particularly helpful when dealing with Section 1. Now, Section 1 of a visual arts exam includes 3 questions. Usually this is made up of a 5-mark question, an 8-mark question and a 12-mark question. Now, there have been times when this has varied, but this is most often the case. Now, these questions obviously increase in difficulty and they often require you to refer to more plates or sources. Now, in terms of tricks of the trade when dealing with Section 1, firstly, it's really important that you know that you will only ever receive 1 question on the frames, 1 question on practice, and 1 question on the conceptual framework. Right, now the order of these change and you cannot predict it. So being able to identify the content area by using your keywords will come in extremely helpful at this point. Now, what you also need to remember is don't struggle with the question. If you read question 1A and you have no idea what content area it's dealing with, then read question B and C and use the process of elimination. There is usually always 1 question that's a really easy question to identify with really obvious keywords. So if you can identify that one, then obviously you only have 2 other content areas to try and work out. And again, if you've been creating that word bank, then you should not have any problems with identifying the different content areas that you're presented with within Section 1. Okay, so an example of Section 1, which is taken from the 2013 trial examination paper, asks you, what does this artwork reveal about the artist? Now, from this question, if we identify the key words, then hopefully you have picked up on artwork and artist. Therefore, the key area of content is the conceptual framework. Question 2 of section 1 asks you to look at both plates 2 and 3. So firstly, you notice that there are more plates to deal with than question 1 because it's worth more marks. The question asks you to explain the artist's use of materials and processes. Now, hopefully in reading this question, you have picked up on the key word of processes in particular, as well as materials, and therefore, hopefully you have identified that the key area of content is practice. Art making practice, to be more specific. Question 3 of section 1 provides you with a quote. So you'll be required to refer to this quote as well as plates 4, 5 and 6. Okay, so as you can see, you have more things to refer to, so the question increases in difficulty. That said, the keywords that you're presented with are actually probably the most easiest to identify out of all 3 questions, because you are given the cultural frame. Okay, so the key area of content is the cultural frame. Section 2 requires you to complete an extended response. In Section 2, you'll be provided with 6 questions. Now, unlike Section 1, you are given the specific content areas in which each question will focus on. So you'll be given 6 questions to choose from. 2 of these will focus on practice, 2 of these will focus on the conceptual framework, and 2 of these will focus on the frames. Now, you are only to choose 1 question to answer. Now, tricks of the trade. Play to your strengths. If by the time your exam you realise that you have a greater understanding of practice, then read the practice questions and attempt one of those. Don't even bother looking at the conceptual framework or frames question unless the practice questions you're provided with you can't answer or don't see a way to answer. Right, and the same goes for if your strengths lie with the conceptual framework or the frames. Okay, don't waste your time. Go straight for the question that you can best answer. Okay, so what you need to remember with section 2 is that you'll be selecting a question, obviously that caters to your strength, but that allows you to best apply your studies of other artists. So this is through your case studies that you've completed, as well as just the artists that have inspired your own art making practice, and apply these to the questions that you're given. Okay, so that in that sense, you can prepare for section 2 just by having a thorough understanding of your artists. Okay, now the difficulty with section 2, however, is that you still need to identify the content areas, in the sense that if you choose to complete a question on practice, you need to acknowledge that practice can be divided into art making, art criticism, and art history. Now, within a question, you may be asked to focus on 1 or 2 or all 3 of these areas, and you need to be able to identify that. So let's take a look firstly at question A. How are artist practices shaped by the innovations of other artists? In your discussion of specific examples, consider materials and techniques, beliefs and theories. Okay, now there is the obvious presentation of artist practice. So we know that we will be dealing with art making practice in that sense. But the innovation of other artists suggests a historical element to your writing. Okay, so this question, in a sense, combines both the art making practice of the artists that you've studied, as well as innovation of other artists. So the artists that they have been inspired by. Okay, so that's you bringing your own knowledge to the table. If we look at question B, you're actually provided with a quote. Photography has liberated painting from the task of imitation. The question asks you to assess the impact of photography on the practice of artists. Now, in this question, it's a little bit harder in order to identify which areas of practice that we're looking at, but the verb assess as well as the word impact implies that we are looking at criticism. So art criticism, in the fact that you're attempting to make a judgment. Alright, so what if practice is not your strong suit? Conceptual framework may be. Alright, so remember the conceptual framework is concerned with the relationship between the agencies, world, audience, artist, and artwork. Alright, now in a question you may not necessarily have to address all four of these agencies, so it's important that you can identify what relationship you're actually looking for. So, for example, question A asks you to explain how new artworks challenge audiences to develop other ways of seeing and understanding art. Okay, so hopefully you've identified that the focus relationship is between artworks and audiences. Alright, so Alright, now question B, however, asks you to discuss how artists use their knowledge of the world to create a visual language. Now, hopefully, again, you have picked up on the term artist and also the term world. Okay, so the relationship that we are going to focus on is between artist and world. Okay, so maybe the practice and the conceptual framework both don't really suit your skill set, and that's okay. Maybe the frames do. So, just a reminder that within the content of the frames there are 4 frames: the cultural, postmodern, subjective, and structural. Okay, and this is where those key words really start to come in handy in order to help you identify which frame the question is actually referring to. Now, if we have a look at question A, it asks you to discuss the subjective nature of artworks from the perspective of the artist and the audience. Now, in a sense, this question is actually quite easy to identify because you are given the term straight up, subjective. Okay, so this particular question is referring to the subjective frame. Okay. Question B asks you to investigate how artists have explored and subverted the rules of traditional art. Okay, now this one is a little bit less obvious, and this is where having a more extensive vocabulary may prove useful to you. And in what I mean is the idea of subverted, okay, rules of traditional art, okay, the idea of challenging or undermining the power and authority of the traditional rules of art, and for that reason it links to the postmodern frame. Oh, okay, are you feeling overwhelmed? Don't be, alright, you just need to start practicing. Look, to tell you the truth, you've been working with these content areas the whole time you've been studying visual arts. Okay, you just may not have been completely aware of it. Okay, so it's not new. We're just trying to refine your understanding a little bit further. All right, so coming up are some sample questions that have been taken from past papers. All right, in order to develop your skills, I just want you to attempt to identify the content areas. So practice conceptual framework or frames, and then push yourself further by identifying the specific area of content within that area of content. So for example, for practice, art making, art criticism, art history. For conceptual framework, relationship between which agencies, audience, world, artist, artwork. And for the frames, which frame is being addressed, subjective, cultural, structural, or postmodern. Okay, the more you practice this, obviously, the easier it will become, and then you'll be able to move on to the next step where you can really start to explore the requirements of the question. Okay, good luck.